All right, recording is on. Welcome, everybody. This is the Network Plumbing Working Group meeting for Thursday, August 30th, 2018. The link to the agenda should be in the Zoom chat. And on that list, just an update on the V1 spec repository. I'm still working on that and still slowly converting things to Markdown. I suppose I could push the PDF version of the spec earlier rather than later, so possibly that's what I will do, and then the Markdown version gets added after that. So at least there's something up. Beyond that, Mike, do you want to talk about the conformance test plan before we dive into the other stuff?
Sure. Yeah. I'm sorry I didn't get to it sooner. Just recently, but I think I signed up to start drafting that.
You
Um,
did.
so I've done so. Um, I don't know where to put it, so I just put up a random Google Doc. And so I just outlined it. I think as we discussed before, I think the place to start is with a binary that just runs a test. It'll take command line parameters, including a kubeconfig file name, so that it knows what cluster to test and what credentials to use. And it kind of punts to external all the concerns about setting up the necessary access. I outlined here some, I think the most obvious spec sections to test. I think that's actually most of them. Yes, the other thing to say first off, right, is what plugins are going to be tested. I think it should be configurable. Definitely people should be able to say, I want to be able to test that my cluster with my particular plugins are accessible to this feature. But there should also be a default set of plugins to test, which I looked through the CNI reference plugins, and it looked to me like the plausible ones that would work would be the ones called Bridge, IP VLAN, Mac VLAN, and VLAN. And then for IPAM, would be the host local IPAM. I mean that just seems like the easiest thing to do. Those should probably work. I'm not real familiar with all of them. In fact, I have a stupid question for you guys. Is there any documentation on these plugins? I could find like a list of them, and I can find their source, but I couldn't find anything in between.
There's a couple of readmes in each of the plugin directories, but they talk about how to use the plugin, not really what IP VLAN or Mac VLAN or etc. really
I mean, I
is.
just picked a bad example to look at. I looked at one of them, and it didn't even have a README in the plugin directory.
Okay. That could be an error. Was that the
IP VLAN.
VLAN one?
I think
IP
so.
VLAN? Okay.
All right, I'll go back and look more comprehensively. Anyway, so I took an initial stab at what would be the likely ones that could be generically used. I mean, the goal here is to come up with a list that you could expect to work in any ordinary Kubernetes cluster. These would basically have to add connectivity, right? I mean, we're not removing any connectivity here, right? These would be things that would be by using the host local IPAM that is, already, I think, configured. Well, double check here. Can the host local IPAM pick up on the configuration that Kubernetes does on the node, right? Kubernetes puts a subnet on each node.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't. But then you've also got, I wouldn't expect it to pick that up because that configuration would be specific to specific to the default network plugin, and might not even be used in the certain default network plugins. Does that make sense? I mean, basically,
Yeah,
host
right.
local is specific, and it is possible to pick up the Kubernetes allocated node subnet, but that requires that host local be the first or the default plugin or in the default chain. And if you're trying to test conformance against like a thick plugin, it would not even use the Kubernetes allocation. Perhaps.
I'm not sure how we can make a generic tester for a thick plugin, so my plan here was just going thin.
Yeah, I mean, guess what I was thinking was that the default plugin could be anything, but then we would also want to create network objects for, obviously we want to create network objects for the secondary or sidecar plugins, and those could use the host local, because theoretically they should all be all the plugins that use that network would be on the same data plane, and so they should be able to talk back and forth to each other, and that host local allocation should theoretically be only within that data plane. Does that make sense? I'm probably not explaining it well enough.
No, I'm just thinking, trying to think through this.
I mean,
It's actually,
it may be the case that the user of this test framework has to supply the configuration for their default network plugin, because that's something we can't necessarily control very well. But all the other things that we create CRDs for certainly could be, more easily controlled by the tester.
Shouldn't the test suite provide just test a set of configs?
Yeah, I think that's what he's talking about here. But the question is, which configs? Are you saying, Feng, that maybe the user should provide a set of network objects?
No, I was thinking we just, as part of the conformance tests, you just say these are the ones we are going to test against because they are common. Let's say we're going to use Flannel, for example.
well, I started with reference plugins, but the question we're on right now is the IPAM part.
Right.
How is the tester going to know, for example, for the host local, you have to tell it a subnet. How is the tester going to know what subnet to specify?
I was assuming that the tester would, when it creates the network object or the network attachment definition, that it would just set a subnet in there, and then all pods that get created that are attached to that network attachment, or attached to that network described by the network attachment definition that we just wrote, will get a unique IP address on that subnet. The problem is, can they communicate? Can we actually set up?
No. Before that,
Okay.
How do we know? How does the tester know what subnet? I mean, it can't just pick a random subnet. It has to pick one that's going to work. That's not going to conflict with something else. I think that's maybe the main concern.
Yeah, this is true. We may just end up having to have a default and allow that to be overridden in some config file or whatever for the tester.
Yeah.
I mean, there's going to have to be a list of requirements, because obviously some of this stuff needs to cooperate with the existing network that you're pointing the tester at. And we'll probably just need to create some configuration that
Right. I guess I was trying to think about just how automatic that could be. I mean, one technique that I can imagine, right? The tester could start by creating a daemon set or even a single pod. We could require that the tester be authorized to make privileged pods, and then it can actually go out and read the configuration. So if necessary, we can make the tester scrape some existing configuration. But I was wondering if we could be a little bit more abstract and direct. Is there a way, for example, through the downward API to pick up this node? Like this is a node spec or status field. It's probably, I don't remember which, but the node spec or status field that has that subnet that Kubernetes allocated. Can the downward API pass that?
I mean, the tester, if it has the kube config, can go read it for any of the given nodes. But again, I don't know why.
You're right. Actually, you're right. Right. I'm getting confused. Of course, right. Where it has to specify a particular subnet, it would. That's right. It'll read. It would have to read nodes. It'll place pods on particular nodes, knowing the subnet on those nodes. Okay, that settles that. That's easy.
Well, I guess, but if 2 points there. First, not all clusters will have that field populated, because not all of them will actually use that allocation feature of Kube.
Yes.
But then second, if they have that field allocated, they are probably already using that field with their default network plugins. So if we add that to a network attachment definition object, then we might have a clash.
I was expecting that it would be that subnet would not be used up, and we could just pick some extra addresses off that subnet for our test.
You could, but you'd have to actually name the network attachment definition network name the same as the default network name. Otherwise, host local doesn't know which database to look into. for checking the conflicts. Basically, part of the uniqueness key for the host local plugin is the network name.
Okay.
If we use a different network name, it's going to possibly allocate the same addresses to both.
Okay.
So
I guess then we'll have to make it a configured thing. I guess the user will have to tell it a subnet to use.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we should just go as simple as possible, and that probably means config at this point. We just pick a default subnet.
No, but we'll still have to divide it amongst the nodes, right? Because if we're using host local, it has to be divided amongst the nodes. So the tester is going to have to divide it among the nodes, place pods on particular nodes, knowing the subnet that it has allocated for that node. All right.
So why are we using host local in the first place then?
Because it's a reference plugin. We can expect it to be there.
What would you suggest, Feng?
I mean, can't we just deploy a DHCP server in the cluster? I mean, because what you want to be able to do is for different interfaces that's deployed to multiple pods on different nodes to be able to talk to each other too, right? And if you do host local, then somebody has to set up routing between nodes on those subnets.
Well, I mean, that said, you can't guarantee that you have layer 2 connectivity between all the nodes anyway, and thus I don't know if...
but wait, he mentioned a more important point. If the communication between nodes isn't going to happen anyway, this gets...
I mean, we can say we don't allow that. We don't test that. That's fine. But if we were going to test that, that would be interesting.
Oh, I completely agree.
You kind of call that out in the doc, Mike. You're talking about the last item there to evaluate whether we can actually talk between these pods.
Yeah.
Well, but I wasn't specific about whether those pods are on the same node or not. I was hoping we could test cross-node, but if that requires additional configuration, that's where we're problem.
Is testing across nodes necessary for validating that an implementation
that's a good point.
Valid, right?
True.
Right. I think I would like to test across nodes, but I agree with the thrust of your thought here, which is it's not a primary issue. It's kind of a consequence that we hope falls out, but the direct functionality is not dependent on same or different node.
So my suggestion here is let's just keep it simple for the moment. And then get something that actually works for at least a few minimal cases and then expand from there.
Yes.
So I would say let's just assume for now that we can only assume, or let's just say we can only assume single node connectivity between pods. But that means that we should be able to definitely test bridge plus host local with a subnet that we define and can be overridden. And that should work no matter what.
Yep. Okay.
So, and then we should, like Doug says, we should be able to test most of these things here because, we just want to make sure that annotations show up, that we may need to inspect the cluster and target specific nodes.
Yes, right. We could read the nodes and I mean, keeping it simple, we'll just pick one node and put up a few pods on the node and exercise it.
Sure. That works. Does anybody have comments on the specific what will be tested section, or does that look good so far? I guess maybe a little bit more detail on some of those sections, Mike, would be good.
Yeah, sure. As I said, I just whipped this together at the last minute. Can you outline what sort of details you think are you thinking of particular sorts of details?
I guess I was just thinking maybe some, really quick call out the spec section numbers, but maybe.
That's there, spec section numbers.
No, I know they're called out, but I mean, I was thinking maybe the titles as well, but whatever. I guess we can just refer back to the doc.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's just editing. I'll be happy to put the titles in.
What exactly do you mean by request network interfaces by name? Do you mean in the extended annotation format?
Right. Yeah. Because it seems like that's necessary for part of the functionality.
Yep.
I don't know how we want to make sure that network. I mean, the section 2 says that network interfaces appear, and I don't know how to check that the requested ones appeared unless I know which ones are requested.
Yep, that's true. Also, were you, at least implementation-wise, I guess we don't need to delve too deeply into that here, but were you thinking that the kubectl exec would be the primary method of checking this kind of stuff?
Well, like I tried to say, it's the API client equivalent of that, right? So this will be a client, so it'll use the API, not the command line.
The reason I ask is because I'm not sure how else we can really jump into the pod namespace.
Right. No, I imagine we'll use a pod that has a shell or something in it that we can just issue commands to and get stuff done in the pod.
Okay.
I mean, keeping it simple, that's the simplest thing to do, right? If we want to get more sophisticated, we can write a binary to run in the pod to do exactly what we want and nothing less or nothing more.
True.
But for keeping it simple, just start with an image that's got a shell in it and exec commands into the shell.
I mean, I guess I was thinking that one approach would be to just have the binary that exercises the API, and it doesn't even have to be a pod. It can just be a binary that you run on some node that has access to the cluster.
Well, wait, slow down. Let me be clear.
Okay,
we're talking about two different things. We're talking about two different things here, okay? So the tester, the thing that drives the test is just a binary. It's not a pod. It's not a container.
Okay, fair enough.
But in order to evaluate some of the stuff that happens, we're going to specify some pods. We'll want to examine the inside of the pod.
Yes.
Right? So to do that, I was imagining the simplest thing to do is to run a pod that has a shell in it, and the tester will exec commands into that shell.
Okay, how would the tester do that?
Isn't there an API for exec?
To be honest, I'm not exactly sure how that works. But I was I was assuming we would just basically shell out to kubectl exec.
I was assuming there's a client for it. I'll have to admit I've never coded against it, but however kubectl does it, hopefully there's a more civilized and direct way. And if not, we'll shell out the kubectl exec.
All right. Anyway, seems we're in agreement. Does anybody have any other thoughts on this? If not, what are the next steps? Is this something you have a little bit of time to work on, Mike, given feedback?
I can update the doc based on our feedback today. I would be deceiving you if I promised much more right now.
Okay.
I have a few general comments, I guess. So one is, I think it'd be great to add another section on test setup. So, what do we expect the state of the cluster to be? When you start a test, what do you expect to be available, I guess, from the cluster that's already set up?
So I did try to address that. It's pretty simple and generic, right? We expect that the implementation of this spec is in place in the cluster. We expect that there's a kube config that can be given to the tester that enables it to manipulate the cluster. It'll have a user in it that has sufficient privileges to create pods and create network definitions.
I think you should write all this down, what all you just said.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Section.
I think that's right.
Okay.
That's very reasonable. Yeah, and I think we can just spell it out. It's not a whole lot. It's just nice to have.
Okay.
And then the other thing is, I think it would be great if, this is more a format, I think we should get the test cases to be, in a number and then in a procedural kind of format, so that we say test case 1, step 1, step 2, 3, 4.
Well, that's a level of detail, right?
Sure.
Right. So I wasn't sure whether that is precisely test plan or some other sort of content.
It could just be a high level, create a network attachment definition with these attributes, start a pod that selects this network, and test exactly test that the network interface shows up in the pod, after a given timeout or something
Right.
like that.
Okay, yeah, that's the next level of detail. I can do that.
Yep.
I think that's in my mind that was a different sort of content. It's more detailed, but I think I can do some. I'll draft that.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Mike, can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Okay. So I have the one question about the so there's some CNI plugin may not support the some specifications such as the IP address or MAC address. I think, especially in case of the WEAP or some thick plugin case, at that time the IP should be comes from the so SDN, which their process, not the we don't have a way to specify the IP from the CNI spec. So
I agree. Actually, if you look at what I wrote for the spec, I avoided saying the tester would specify the IP or the MAC. So I did deliberately leave that up to the plugin.
Okay, yeah, and then yeah, I'm very happy. So maybe if we get the result, we have the kind of the some table about some plugin supports MAC, but the IP is not, or something like that from the.
Yes, we could go on to a further level of development and optionally exercise the ability to specify the MAC or the IP for certain plugins.
Okay.
That's for later development. Like we said,
Yeah.
just start with something simple to get going.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, let's start a small start, of course. Thanks.
Any other thoughts or comments? And also, does anybody have resources or time to work on this in the very near future if Mike does not?
I will definitely try to contribute to it for sure. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Fung.
Going forward, I'd like to help as well. I might be a little bit limited here in the short term, at least.
All right, sounds good. I will mark that down. Fung and Doug will help Mike out. All right, you're committed.
Okay, guys, make sure you have email addresses in the agenda notes, and I will correspond directly with you after the next level of detail is ready.
All right, next up, short-term items. What are people's thoughts on, or everyone's thoughts on exactly what we should be discussing for the next 3 months with kind of a target of like a v1.5 spec? Just to set the ground rules here, I feel like they should be fairly simple and fairly non-controversial from a higher level. But what we might be controversial is, like the wording or the keys or something like that. I mean, not controversial, hopefully, but things to decide shouldn't be generally large things. I had gone through the doc and identified, I think, 3 or 4 of those that I thought were reasonably small next steps, but I'd like to hear from others as well what they think.
So I think the security one I may be relatively simple. I think there's an obvious idea. I'm not quite sure what's the implementation looks like with the latest thinking about this sort of stuff. But I think the idea is that we should allow a pod to use or to reference a network attachment definition if and only if the service account that pod is running with is authorized to read that network attachment definition.
Okay. And I just marked down that I thought maybe this was related to number 6. I think there's sort of like 2 approaches to the same topic, and I don't see Corral on the call right now, and he had added the emission controller, but I thought part of the emission controller item in number 6 was potentially about security. I could be wrong there.
This may be a stupid question. Are we talking about multi-tenant Kubernetes clusters here, or is this a more general thing? Does it apply to both?
I guess I would think it would apply to both. I mean, I'd certainly be interested in multi-tenant security, as in ensuring that some users who are not authorized for a particular tenant should not be able to add networks that have been defined for other tenants or that kind of thing.
Fair enough. I think mentally I haven't quite got there.
Sense?
I'm still thinking about single tenant because that's most of our use cases at the moment. But I can see that the multi-tenant, right?
Okay.
So yeah, I think what I said, it may not be the entirety of the security question. I think it's the one that makes the most sense to standardize on, though. I think the others are more, I mean, like the question of who can write a network attachment definition that references a given network. That's a little difficult to get into because these networks are not necessarily Kubernetes objects anyway.
Yeah, the networks aren't, and a lot of that has to be administrator defined.
Well, I'm not sure how they are. They might be Kubernetes objects. Some of us are working on systems in which networks are Kubernetes objects, but they might not be. So I'm not sure, Dan, I understood your previous remark about security.
Which one was that?
You were talking about what someone else was thinking or saying about what this means.
Guess that's not clear enough.
I'm sorry.
To figure out
Any,
what remark I might have
okay,
made
I'm sorry.
earlier.
So anyway,
So I asked about multi-tenant. Is that what you're referring to? I asked about multi-tenant. Is that what you're referring to?
no, before you said that, Dan had said something. I wanted to get back to that.
Item number 6, Corral had admission controller for network object. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Oh, no. Right. So the question I thought that number 1 was about was, and it kind of says it here, right? Given that these network attachment definition objects already exist, what pod should be able to effectively use which network attachment definitions?
Right, and I had thought that number 6 was related because one of the ways to implement those kinds of checks could be with admission control.
Oh, well, that would be admission control on the pods.
Yeah, exactly. If the pod is not able to access or not allowed to access a given network attachment definition object because, the permissions aren't there in whatever system you have, or maybe it's in a different namespace that the user who's adding the pod should not have access to, that kind of thing. Admission control would be one way to enforce that.
Right. Now that's not 6. 6 is admission control for the attachment definition objects.
Ah, okay.
Right?
Yeah, he's talking about something else. Yeah, Corral.
I guess.
Yeah, from number 6.
Because there were 2 parts to admission control, and one of them was validation as well. And maybe that's what Corral was talking about for number 6.
Well, again, he's talking about the network attachment definition objects, not the pods.
Fair enough. Okay.
And I think that's, so I'm not quite sure what is the question there. I mean, certainly there's a validation. Well, let's see, these are CRDs, so we're going to write, have we? We've actually written the schema for them, have we?
We've written the schema, but we can't actually do like JSON validation of the config item inside the object.
Yes,
So
that was
what I was talking about there.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. Yeah.
All right, I got confused. So I made a note of that, or asked Corral about that. Some of these items in this list are less than specific.
Right. So going back to the top of the list.
Yep.
I think that for the question specifically of which pods can reference which attachment definitions, that seems to me like something that we ought to be able to map onto the question of can the pod security account read the attachment definition. It seems to be it's natural to have that alignment. The pod should be able to reference it if its security account can read it.
I would agree. Do you think that is something that we can work out in the next 3 months, or will that take longer?
Man, if we can't do that, what can we do?
Well, is a really. We made a spec in 6 months. Whether or not it's a implementable spec remains to be seen, I guess.
Well, no, I think we know that.
Yeah.
So I think this is a relatively simple thing. It may require some, unusually high privileges in whatever enforces it, but apart from, and that'll get up back onto generic questions of, excessive privilege, which we already have as a, bleeding topic in Kubernetes anyway. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so Mike, would you like to own this topic for the moment?
Okay, sure.
And flesh out what you think the issues here are and what some possible solutions are.
Okay,
At least just to kick this off.
Sure.
Okay.
I have to stop here. If I promise anything more, I'm going to be completely delinquent.
All right. That's fine. Okay, so I'm just adding some notes to the agenda doc. Mike will take the security. What should we say there?
The pod, the pod to attachment definition security question or privilege question.
How would you put that into a question?
What's the right way to exert control over that, over which pods can reference which network attachment definitions?
Perfect. All right. Next up, anybody else have thoughts on short-term items?
It feels like at least number 14 should be fairly easy to do.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, Doug?
Yeah, totally. And Suresh, feel free to chime in too on this one because Suresh and I had chatted about this before. But basically, the gist is like right now, and we might have actually removed this from the spec. I feel like I'd alluded to it at once or whatever, is that, when you're using something that you expect to create an interface in the pod, that you would expect to have a unique interface for each, a unique interface name for each, attachment that you create. So, you might, like, the way that we did that with Multis is to have like your default network is ETH0, and then we have a net 1, net 2, net 3, net 4, etc. for each one that you have there. But the idea behind this is, what if you'd like a way that you can predict what each network name will be? So that maybe, you like create a hash of a name or something like that, so that you could say, okay, I'm attaching a Mac VLAN here, and I want to know that that's going to always be Mac VLAN at B33F or something like that. So you have like some, I don't know, hex hash after it. So you could predict what the name would be. That was kind of the idea behind it.
Yeah, and it's linked to like figuring out like dynamic networking, right? That's like where this started from, where we can add like interfaces after without restarting the pod.
Okay, so this is a generic issue in our spec already. Can someone remind me what we decided about it?
It's all up to the implementation. It just needs to make sure that each attachment gets a unique name in the pod's namespace.
But our spec also says that the spec pod spec can stipulate the interface name.
Yes, it can.
So then the implementation has no choice. The plugin has no choice. It has to give the requested name.
Yeah, if you specify it in the network attachment.
No,
definition,
in the spec,
or the
in the annotation that specifies the desire, in the pod annotation that specifies the desire.
right. Yeah, sorry, not the attachment definition, but
Right.
the annotation.
And as I said earlier, I was actually planning to rely on this because the tester has to know, what to look for to see that it actually showed up.
To some degree, but no matter whether you specify the interface name in the annotation, it should show up in the status.
Okay, good point. Good point. Right. So it doesn't have to.
So,
but since it is in the spec, right. I thought we should test it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, makes sense, Mike.
I mean,
but my question is, sorry, if I just help me remember, right?
Go ahead.
Isn't it true that for at least some kinds of network interfaces, you don't have complete freedom? All right, like there's a prefix that's fixed.
No, I think you can rename them at
You
any
can call them
point.
anything you want. I mean, within
the limitations of the kernel's
there's a length,
naming,
right? There's a length and character content.
Yep.
But and character
correct.
set.
It's like 15.
But within that.
Yep, it's like 15 characters or something like that, and you can.
I think it's like 15 characters, right? Like so that's like we wanted to like specify some kind of format so that works minimum across all the implementations.
Yeah. So Doug and Suresh, was the intent here to allow predictable naming without having to necessarily use the extended format annotation?
Yes.
When selecting
yes.
it? Okay.
So the idea then was to have some default rule for what the name will be if it's not specified?
Exactly.
And at least to me, the one thing that I understood would be a little bit tricky about this is something that, at least to me, I feel like we considered as a first-class consideration as, hey, it's a pretty likely use case that you're going to attach the same network multiple times, right? So I feel like that, to me is the tricky bit there.
Right. Okay. So,
Doug, do you want me to put up like a little bit more descriptive tester on this?
Yeah, I would love it. If you could flesh out that number 14, that would be awesome, Suresh. Thank you.
Okay, I'll do that. Yeah.
So, I mean, this seems to me like we've already been talking about it for a little bit. Seems to me like it could be a within 3 month possibility if somebody is dedicated to work on it. But if we don't actually resource this item, then it seems like it'll drag out a little bit.
Yeah, I can take it with Doug now.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Doug, Suresh, I'll just update the meeting minutes again.
And the other one that I'm looking at that you didn't mark is, I think number 5 should be fairly easy to decide because I think there's very minimum impact to the spec itself.
Yeah, hang on a sec here. I'm just
Sure.
trying to update. You said number 5. Wait. You mean device plugin, CNI, and resource management?
Yes.
Alignment?
Because I think this is going to be really all implementation and really all Motus implementation almost. It's not spec.
So what would you expect to come out of this item? If we address this in some way, what's the final product of this?
You mean final product to the changes that we're going to make to the spec? Or?
Yeah, changes we make to the spec, or anything that this group would have to work on or agree on.
What I would expect at this point is actually I'm hoping that we will reach the conclusion that we will make no changes to the spec. and that any change that we need to align with device plugin is purely an implementation, that it does not, like the thing we need to discuss is, does aligning with device plugin violates or require any additional changes to the spec? And I'm hoping the conclusion is going to be no.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, so basically, we should put this on the list, and various members of this group will continue those discussions and determine within a few months whether or not we actually need to do further work.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think they should, the people on this list, right, who are in number 5, should bring, the actual implementation that they're thinking about over to this group and say, here are the interactions that's going to happen with the implementation. Do we see, do the whole group see any problem with this? And do we all think there is no impact? And hopefully everybody agree there is no impact. So.
Okay. All right.
And then let's see. Sorry, keep going. Number
Go ahead.
7, you marked it as short term. I suppose it should be a short term, but it just seems strange that the CRD can be a optional part of the spec.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who brought this up originally. I think that might have been Peter.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Peter. Yep.
Okay.
Peter Zab.
And yeah, he's not around to talk about it at this point.
Okay.
I guess I just thought that it would, if we decided to make those things optional, it wouldn't be a huge change to the spec. I think
That's true. Okay.
though it would or might require more discussion. I think we can punt this item for this meeting and maybe come back in 2 weeks and see if Peter can talk a little bit more about it, because I don't remember the whole scope of what he was looking for here.
Sure.
So I remember some of it, and I think the idea was pretty simple, but not quite trivial, right? The idea was to say the spec really does cover 2 things. This covers how one defines a way of making network attachments in this custom resource, and it defines how a pod can request the use of that and receive the results of using that. And one could imagine factoring this spec into 2. And so the part that discusses the pod annotations simply says these annotations reference methods of making network attachments, without further specification in this spec, and then leave it to the other spec to say, this is how we define ways of making network attachments. And the motivation was, right, he had other ways of making network attachments. He wanted to be able to use the pod annotations with his other ways of making specifying ways of making network attachments. I believe in his case, he said it was built into his system, but I think the generic idea was whether it's built in or defined, user-defined in some other way, the point is just there's other ways of defining it.
Yeah, that's bringing some of that back. Okay. That's good context. Thanks for that, Mike. I'm not sure we have enough agreement or context yet, though, to actually put it on the list. And
right.
Peter's not around. I don't know if we could assign somebody to it.
Right.
So
right. I'm not taking it. We'll wait till he shows up and takes it.
Okay, so we will punt this decision to September 13th. Okay. Do you have any other items, Feng? You want?
No, that was it.
Okay. I have the ones that I marked down in the doc too. Did anybody have any others to bring up before I run over mine? Take that as a no. So number 4, was some bandwidth and capability flags. I think that's probably something we need to address, is how capabilities get passed back and forth between plugins and the Kubernetes runtime.
Did you have a specific technical definition behind the word capabilities in mind here?
Yeah, so Kubernetes can pass down things like bandwidth limitations and port mapping to the default network plugin. But
I remember. So
yeah.
CNI has a concept of capabilities.
Yes.
So
yep.
That's what we're talking about.
But with some of the network readiness issues that we have, and especially the alternate network readiness method that we had added to the spec, that's not as easily possible to figure out what the default network plugin actually supports and thus advertise that to Kubernetes. So I think we need a little bit more work around that. But then also we need to figure out what, if anything, the sidecar networks should get passed.
Is this even a question? I mean, since we've, in some sense, incorporated, or we're basically using CNI, which already has an answer for capabilities. Do we need to say or do anything more?
I think there's some parts of the spec that could be updated for that. And like I said, with the readiness thing, that's actually a potential hole in the spec, or at least something that is unanswered or unimplemented in the spec at this point. So I think there's more to say here, but I don't know exactly what that would be right now. And so I think the item for this would be, or the immediate item would be, figure out what holes or gaps there are in the spec with respect to capabilities for the default plugin as well as for the sidecars, and then come back to the group with some suggestions on how to update the spec.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Tomo and Doug, since you're also on the item here, do you have any thoughts on that? Agreement, disagreement on whether that's something that we can address in the next couple of months?
Yep. This seems to be low-hanging fruits relatively, I think. So.
Okay.
+1 from me.
Okay. And that is number 4. All right. Let's see, I'll try to run through some of their ones pretty quick. Emission controller for network attachment definition object. I also had kind of short term because that seems like a fairly contained task. I mean, if it is in fact at this point just for validating that the config item is valid JSON or whatever, then that seems pretty easy. However, I don't have time to work on it. And Corral's not in this meeting, so I'm not sure if he has time to work on it. So I'm thinking we should probably punt that one to the next meeting to see if Corral can resource it.
Yeah, I think he's planning to implement it. So yeah,
okay.
I think that should be okay to postpone.
All right, we will confirm with him. Punted until... All right. Let's see, Peter Z had another one for network attachment selection annotation with static IP. This is number 9 in the doc, by the way. Doesn't work for replica sets, and so somehow have well-known IPs or ranges for pods in a replica set. I think he had brought this up in one of our meetings and also posted on the list. Currently with the spec, we really only support a single static IP or specific static IPs. And that doesn't really work for replica sets because the replica sets get automatically created, and so they would sort of duplicate some of that information and possibly use the same IP for multiple pods. So Peter was looking for some kind of spec update to
right. So I think this, I don't understand why he's even worried about this. I mean, it seems to me just inconsistent. If you're specifying static IPs, you're managing the pods individually. And this is not unique to what we're doing, right? Any use of CNI or anything, maybe that's not a good argument. I'll just say, in Kubernetes in general, right, we're not promising IPs, and I don't know. I'm just not impressed that it's something we should take up.
Okay, and so in other words, it seems like we have more discussion about this one, so let's also punt this one for the moment.
We should at least wait for the advocate to be here.
That's true. Although that said, I think I added it to this list based on his email.
Okay, but the person who's
Sort of
advocating for it
proxy.
should be here.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, and let's see here. The last one, which might be an easy spec change, but might generate more discussion, was number 10, which I also added, and I'm willing to be a semi-advocate for this one. And that is parallel implementations running in the same cluster are not currently possible. Maybe they should be possible. What would that look like? Does anybody have thoughts on this or objections?
I'm not sure what it means even.
Okay, so what it means is take the example of say Multus is one of the, or is an implementation in the cluster, and that's like the default CNI plugin. What Peter would like to do is to also have a device plugin based system running in the same cluster. And have some of the network attachment definitions owned by the device plugin based implementation and others owned by Multus. So that Multus would run for some pods, but the device plugin would run for other pods, and this would be on a per network attachment definition basis. So for example, if a pod selects 3 networks, 2 of them should be done by Multus and the third should be handled by device plugin. Then Multus would ignore the device plugin managed one, but connect the other 2. And then the device plugin would handle the one that it's responsible for, and they would both update the status independently of each other. Does that make more sense, Mike?
Kind of, but kind of not. I mean, it seems like mixing relationships oddly. I guess I'm just not quite sure I understand. I mean, if we forget about the multi for a moment and just think about the case of the one attachment, right, that Kubernetes normally gives you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is he thinking of a situation where the one attachment will be made by a CNI plugin for some pods and by something based on device manager for another?
I think I want to say yes, if I understand you correctly. I believe that in his scenario, the default cluster-wide network is always attached by, in this case, Multus. But you may have other networks like SRIOV or something else like that that are actually handled by the device plugin and are managed resources, which might be, like there might only be 8. And the device plugin knows these things. And so this one is sort of, in some ways, a bridge between resource management, device plugin, and the specification. But I think it needs a little bit more explanation and probably needs a little bit more thought. I think it's probably something that could be done in the next 3 months, but I'm happy to punt it until the next meeting and try to flesh out the description more.
So this is reminding me of something we discussed, which is currently we're focused on CNI, but it doesn't necessarily have to be only CNI.
Yes.
Right. So maybe this is just a way of saying, here's somebody who wants something that's not CNI.
Yeah, that is true. But he also was interested in having it coexist with Multus in the short term.
Well, but I think
this is not about CNI actually, right?
Right. So in fact, I mean, Multus being an implementation of this, it's not really that Multus is about CNI, except that the CNI plugins are the only ones Multus knows how to delegate to.
Correct.
Right. But if we had some more general framework, some more general thing of which CNI was one example and something else was something else, right, then we would expect an implementation of this to be able to call out to whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So
I was just using Multus as an example because that's what Peter was interested in.
But my point is that if Multus aims to remain an implementation of this, it would have to it would have to generalize so that it can not only call CNI plugins but also call the other methods, the other kinds of attachments.
No, it doesn't.
No, not really.
Well, then you have to add another multiplexer.
It wouldn't necessarily be another multiplexer. It would just, okay, let's, I guess in the 0 minutes we have left, well, okay, we have 0 minutes left. Let me try to describe more what I think he means here, and maybe get him to actually.
Well, let's just do that.
update the
We're out of time.
Yeah.
Let's, you know,
Yep.
we'll come back to it when he's
Let's
here.
punt this one for now.
Yeah.
All right. So we have 4 items that we think we can get done in the next 3 months or so. I guess on the next meeting, we will look into the longer term items. And the next meeting, we will also take a look at some of these items that we've punted and try to get their advocates to attend so they can talk about them a little bit more. I think in the meantime, there wasn't a lot of action on this V2 considerations document and explanation. So I think if there are any owners of these items, if they could continue to add more description to them by the next meeting, that would be good. And then we'll have a little bit more context. Any further thoughts or comments before we close it out for the week? If not, all right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
All right,
guys.
thank you.
All right, bye.
Thanks.